Morning, everyone. Shalom and welcome to the Charles L. Feinberg Center for Messianic Jewish Studies here in Brooklyn, New York. My name is Robert Walter. I'm on staff with Chosen People Ministries as the New York Regional Director, and I'm a graduate of the Feinberg program and still involved with the seminary in a number of ways. And we want to thank you all who are joining us in person, of course, and then everyone who's joining us online as well. Welcome to Brooklyn, and we hope you're able to enjoy a bagel while you're here. Now, we are very blessed this morning and really throughout this entire day because we are picking up with another one of our Feinberg Lecture Series. And the topic today will be the early church and the Jewish people, the first 3 centuries. And we have a very special guest presenter joining us today who will be bringing us through really these first 3 centuries of history. And I'm sure it's going to bless you. I'm sure it's going to be very intriguing and new information probably, and I'm sure edifying as well. So let me introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Daniel Nessim. He is the son of Jewish parents who also believe in Yeshua, in Jesus. His mother is a survivor of the Holocaust, having been hidden in Berlin throughout the Second World War. His father was from a Jewish family from Baghdad in Cairo. A few years after his arrival in England in the 1950s, Daniel's father became the first in his family to believe in Yeshua. Daniel has thus had a privilege rarely accorded to Jewish believers in Yeshua, having a heritage of faith in his own family. Thus, at the age of 7, Daniel already knew that Yeshua was his Messiah and Lord, and made a decision to accept him as his Savior. After the family moved to Vancouver, Canada, where Daniel's father led a mission to the Jewish people, Daniel eventually began a career in the engineering field. Before long, however, he studied for a bachelor's in theology from Northwest Baptist Bible College, and then went to Regent College for a Master of Arts in Christian Studies. It was shortly after this that Daniel joined Chosen People Ministries, working out of Seattle, Washington. After a few years, Daniel and his wife went to England with their son, where they established the United Kingdom branch of Chosen People Ministries. They also planted a Messianic Jewish congregation in the heart of England's Jewish community. Dr. Nessim holds a PhD in theology and religion from the University of Exeter in England, having focused his studies on the life of the earliest believers and their beliefs. He is the co-author of Introducing Your Jewish Friend to Yeshua, and has also written Derech Yeshua, The Way of Salvation, as well as a Messianic Jewish prayer book. Daniel is passionately committed to seeing other Jewish people come to accept the messiahship of Yeshua. He believes that there is a great need to put shoe leather on the fact that Jewish people can believe in Yeshua and still be Jewish. Thus, he maintains his own Jewish lifestyle as a personal commitment while encouraging other Jewish people to accept their Messiah. And I'm sure you'll see throughout today that Daniel is a very skilled communicator who has spoken extensively in Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Israel. And he currently serves among the Jewish people of Washington State and Vancouver, BC, and teaches in the Messianic Jewish movement. So without further ado, let's please greet and welcome Dr. Daniel Nessim.
Pleasure to be here this morning, and I think you'll find this to be a very interesting time, at least I hope so, because the time that we're going to look at, the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, or the common era as we call it, is crucial to the development of both Judaism and Christianity. It's a period that both faiths look back on in some ways as a model for what they would like today and would like to see today. Our first three centuries lasts roughly until the Nicene Council took place in today what is called Nikkei, Turkey. It covers a lot of time, 300 years. and covers some vast, shattering changes for both the Jewish people and Christianity. This is a story of theological development driven by social necessity that transformed the early church from one form of being the Jewish people to another, one could say. Our period begins when the church was the Jewish people, in that its members were all Jewish, through a period during which it began and increasingly rejected the Jewish people, to an age where, although few of its members were Jewish, it considered itself to be the rightful Jewish people, the people of Israel. At the beginning of our period, when the church was the Jewish people, all of its members were Jews or proselytes. In this hour, we'll delve into what that meant. So our title for this first lecture is The Essenes, the Apostles, and the Didache. And I carry with me the first volume of the Apostolic Fathers from Loeb, which was my companion, close companion, for many years as I studied the Didache in the UK and in Seattle. We'll ask, what is or was the religion of this earliest church? What were their presuppositions? Can we discern their theological map from their writings and those they drew on? How did they perceive themselves? And how did these earliest believers perceive what we now call the Gentile mission? In our second hour, we will pursue a little bit further the texts and basically written remnants that tell us about this early period, this first 3 centuries. As we do so, we'll cover various authors, and I seem to have lost my paper. Just one sec. Computer went blank on me. There we go. We'll look at various authors and see the development of thought that they have within themselves, but also the development that they are displaying that existed in the early church at that period. We will particularly look at texts that reflect on the peoplehood of the Jews and their relationship to the early church. In the third hour, we will once again look a little bit at the Essenes, but this time we will look at them in relationship to the early church as a whole and to its social, cultural context. The aim of this inquiry is to help to redefine and nuance the quest for the supposedly undefiled Christian Judaism, a mythical Christian Judaism that today, even in the Messianic world, is sometimes looked upon as a prototype. We're going to look at not only this, but also nascent Christianity, which is one of the terms we used to talk about Christianity before it was an ism, and frankly, before Judaism was an ism. We're going to make some pertinent observations regarding the so-called parting of the ways. And we also want to observe how in some respects, maybe most respects, at that time, the ways never parted. Further, in an age that has seen the Jewish reclamation of Jesus, that is our age now, we've seen the new perspective on Paul, which is superseded in some areas by the Paul within Judaism endeavors, and a beginning of a Jewish reclamation of Christian literature. We're going to see that and evaluate it. So our period begins in a day that is dominated by the temple in Jerusalem. It's dominated in those early days, as we read in the book of Acts, and as we see recorded later on, by the teaching of the apostles. But this is also a day when, paradoxically, Israel has somewhat of a monarchy in place. It continues in an era in which scholars struggle to determine the boundary lines between Judaism and Christianity. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that Jews at this time did not define themselves as a religion. The term Judaism, while it does occur here and there, was not common. The Jewish people did not define themselves as a religious group, but more as a people who had a certain covenant relationship with God. As Daniel Boyarin put it in his simply in his book, The Jewish Gospels, actually there was no Judaism at all, neither was there Christianity. In fact, the very idea of religion in the modern sense, with all of its isms, was foreign to that day. This leads Matt Jackson McCabe, a favorite author of mine, to suggest that in a sense, everything before the 4th century was Judeo-Christianity. Not Jewish, not Christian, but in the so-called Christian world, Judeo-Christianity. This isn't to say that everything before the 4th century was not Christian or was not Jewish, but among believers in Jesus, to a large degree, the two were somewhat merged. Then as now, even answering the question, who is a Jew, has proven elusive. While intermarriage was rare, it seems, in that day, nevertheless, today, it was difficult sometimes to define who was a Jew. Levels of observance varied tremendously. So how do we distinguish between the early church and the Jewish people? Edwin Broadhead, in his book Jewish Ways of Following Jesus, provides a possible way out of the impasse, and one that can help us determine the polarities of this discussion. It revolves around those who were presumably in between the church and the synagogue. Broadhead suggests that in terms of Jewish Christianity, or its equally problematic but somewhat preferable Christian Judaism, it is best to consider it a form of meta-language used in a technical sense. We can't really say what is Jewish Christianity or Christian Judaism because the border lines between them were so blurred and varied. There is an absence of any definable homogeneous group or consistent ideology. In terms of Christianity, however, Jewish Christianity can actually be defined by exclusion. As Broadhead suggests, excluded from this definition of Jewish Christianity would be all conceptions of an Israel replaced by or superseded by Christianity, all systems that abrogate or replace the law, all allegorizing or spiritualizing interpretations of the law, and all Christological paradigms that call into question the basic integrity of monotheism. These represent a disruption rather than a continuation of Israel's heritage. What I'm suggesting is that if we define Jewish Christianity of the day in line with Broadbent's proposal, we will also have a useful yardstick by which to define the Jewish people in contradistinction to the church. Put in positive terms, then, for our purposes, the Jewish people are those characterized by a conscious identity of being the people of Israel, a people who have a covenantal relationship with God manifest in the law, fidelity as well to the one God and God alone. This distinction will be manifest as we look at the literary milieu of the New Testament in the era when the early church was the Jewish people. It's reasonable to suppose that the apostles and those around them did not know that they were writing what would later be called the New Testament. It goes without saying in our context today that they did not expect that they were founding a new religion, simply that they were proclaiming the apex of God's plan for Israel and the world in Israel's Messiah, Yeshua. These presuppositions place their writings within the Jewish world. As a result, it behooves us to survey their literary world, for in treating the early church and the Jewish people, our records for this first period are almost exclusively literary. There are some archaeological remains, but often they are disputable. What were the writings that they were familiar with? Were they influenced by the content of these writings and the forms that they were written in? We're asking, what were the Jews reading in the apostles' day? We have numerous categories of material, categories which we may be superimposing from our era onto theirs. The first is closest to the Jerusalem Jewish world and comprises the Dead Sea Library. It, in addition, overlaps with what we call the Apocrypha, which also, to some degree, you could say overlaps with what we call the Pseudepigrapha. And, of course, there was the Hebrew Bible itself. Jews of the day also read writings from Egypt and from Syria. In addition, there were writings by Philo of Alexandria, who was in Egypt and forms a class of its own. And then thirdly, another completely different realm of writing that some would have been familiar with, but certainly not the majority, would have been the writings of the Gentile world, which not only included Greek literature, but also Roman writers such as Cicero and Varro. These writings would have been known by many. While literacy was low by modern standards, this did not preclude some knowledge of their contents by the unlettered. The first place in our literature that we see any relationship between the early church and the Jewish people is in the New Testament itself. The book of Romans is famous itself for Paul's frequent pivots from addressing Jews and Gentiles in the Church of Rome. However, both Jewish and Gentile, these were together the early church. And just as the Jewish readers of the epistle were members of the church, so they were also members of the Jewish people. In order to have a constructive discussion then, as we consider the Jewish people and the church in the first 3 centuries, we do need to continue drawing some sort of distinction between Jew and Gentile. These are certainly distinctions that are affirmed in the New Testament and in Romans, for example, where Paul asserts his identity as an Israelite. He speaks to the Gentiles as the other, with phrases such as, "Now I am speaking to you, Gentiles," and refers to their ongoing relationship with God in chapter 11, asserting that they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. This then is the platform that we're laying for our exploration of the early church and the Jewish people. The awareness of peoplehood among the Jewish people and an awareness of their enduring relationship with the God of Israel. In the first century, one cannot properly distinguish between the church and the Jewish people in large degree because in the very early years, the church is the Jewish people, and the challenge of the day at that time, as we know well, was how to integrate the Gentiles into that ecclesia. Any reader of the Dead Sea Scrolls will see in short order that they demonstrate tremendous variety. Some would say that they cannot be the writings of one sect alone, and that has a lot of merit to it. The writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls include the Damascus document, another writing we call the Serek HaYachad, previously known as the Manual of Discipline or Community Rule, the Book of Jubilees, many sectarian writings, books, a book on the temple called the Temple Scroll that exists in multiple copies, commentaries, legal texts, other texts that are categorized as rewritten Torah, and the books of Enoch and more. Norman Golb has argued extensively that the scrolls are obviously not the work of one group, noting that just about every single scroll is written in a different hand. And so he theorizes that possibly they were a temple library or a library from somewhere in Jerusalem, spirited away from Jerusalem for safekeeping before the first Jewish revolt. And such things need to be considered. And we should remember, of course, that we're in the period very shortly after the academies of Hillel and Shammai, and certainly there were significant libraries, we assume, in Jerusalem, in part because of that. With all that said, it is still evident from Josephus and Pliny that there was such a thing as an Essene sect, and that many of their distinctives are indeed reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the most significant scrolls is 1QS, found in the first cave, as the letter or number 1 signifies, the Serek HaYachad, which I mentioned a minute ago. The Serek speaks of its community with 3 different types of members. There are those in Aaron who volunteer for holiness, the priests. There are those in Israel who belong to truth, that is, the rest of the Israelites, and interestingly, the Levites are skipped over in this division. And thirdly, there are those who are Gentile proselytes who join them in community. So this is reminiscent of the triple denomination of Torah readers in the synagogue, those who are of the priests, Levites, and all of Israel, but it is different, and significantly so, particularly because they include Gentiles. Membership in this Yahad, as the community called itself, the community, is characterized by immersion. It's not immersion to signify conversion, because most of its members were Israelites, but it is immersion to signify not only ritual purity, but also purity of heart. The efficacy of this immersion is directly tied to teshuvah, repentance from evil. And the word shuv is frequently used. For those wicked people who refrain from entering the Yahad, we are told ceremonies of atonement cannot restore their innocence, neither cultic waters their purities. He or they cannot be sanctified by baptism in oceans and rivers, nor purified by mere ritual bathing. The Yahad also had an instructor who was to enlighten and teach all the sons of light about the character and fate of humankind. So hopefully you're beginning to draw connections between the Yahad and the early believers in Jerusalem. More to the point that we'll get to, the Serach did not propose or presuppose that all of its members lived in its major communities. The major community that we know of most clearly is that of Qumran. However, there was also Jerusalem. Its members might dwell, according to this document, in diverse locations, but were to eat, pray, and deliberate communally. Some of these groups might be quite small, and so they are instructed that whenever 10 men belonging to the party of the Yahad are gathered, a priest must also be present. The men shall sit before the priest by rank, and in that manner their opinions will be sought on any matter. There's also an aspirational aspect to the Serach, like the New Testament. It looks forward to the day when there are men who preserve faith, emunah, in the land, with self-control and a broken spirit, atoning for sin by working justice and suffering affliction. When such men come to be in Israel, the Serach instructs that they are to go into the wilderness to prepare the truth, as it is written, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." This means expounding of the law decreed by God through Moses for obedience, end quote. Is it any wonder that James Charlesworth theorized that John the Baptist had a close connection to the Essenes? And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit more about his interesting paper later on. The Serach has no introduction to speak of. A lot of these texts don't. They delve right in. It is simply introduced, however, repeatedly and more or less throughout as a text belonging to the instructor. So here's this scroll belonging to the instructor. It is for him, and he is going to deliver its instructions to the people, and he's going to govern according to its instructions, and also himself live according to its instructions. It instructs how people should be initiated into the covenant of the community, and it also gives rules for membership. A lot of rules. Toward the end of the third column, the paths of light are contrasted with the paths of darkness, with the God of Israel being the one who created the spirits of light and darkness. The following columns describe the life of the initiate in the community, both in terms of heart attitudes, rules for gatherings, and food laws. Following this, there are rules that are set forth regarding community organization and discipline of errant members. Rules for the instructor and a significant messianic bent appear then in the 9th column, which we're getting close to the end, which looks forward to the day when the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel come to Israel, or the Yahad. Finally, the 10th and 11th columns conclude with a prayer to be delivered by the instructor, and these prayers have an increasingly soteriological bent. Thus he says, "As for me, if I stumble, God's loving kindness forever shall save me. By his loving kindness shall he provide my justification. By his righteousness shall he cleanse me of human defilement and the sin of human kindness." So, while I think we could probably see some similarities in thought to some of the things that we see in the New Testament, we can also see some shades of difference. But I'd like to suggest, and I have to say I'm biased because it was the subject of years of work, that I am intrigued by the literary similarities between the Serach and the Didache. which was a first century instructional manual from the apostles for the Gentiles. It has somewhat the same format. It begins with the personal, with how people are to be inducted into the community. It continues into rules and principles by which the community might be governed, and it concludes with maybe not so much a soteriological, but an eschatological epilogue. Its introduction, as represented by the incipit title, and the incipit title is the title that is in the text itself, the first lines of the text, is quite likely original to the text. There's really no good reason for thinking that it is not, other than that it provides such a good introduction to the text. It identifies the teaching as that of the apostles, while not claiming that it is authored by the apostles themselves. This is somewhat after the fashion of the Serach, which is written for the instructor, but not by the instructor. But obviously, an instructor has composed the book. Just as the Serach broaches the subject of the divergent paths of light and darkness, early on in its column 3, so very early on, the Didache broaches the subject of two ways, one of life and one of death. Both texts stress that there is a huge, stark difference between these two ways. While the Didache says bluntly the difference is great between the two ways, the Serach informs the instructor that God loves one spirit, the spirit of life, but abhors the other, hating its every impulse for all time. And so the general course proceeds. The Serach describing the rules by which one should live in the community, quite strict rules, and the Didache providing instruction that is somewhat halachic in flavor. In the Didache, it's a book of 16 chapters, versified or put into verse and chapter by a man called Philotheus Bryennios, who discovered the manuscript in 1873 in Jerusalem and published it in 1883. He discovered it in the library of the monastery where he lived or worked, in the Jerusalem monastery of the Most Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople, which we know today as Istanbul. He divided it up so that the first 6 chapters comprise what we call the two ways section of the Didache. They are a detailed catalog of acceptable and unacceptable behavior, particularly geared towards Gentiles who might not know typically Jewish Torah-aware, we could say, Torah-aware understanding of what is acceptable. Interestingly, both documents end this section with comments regarding the food laws. The Serach talks about pure food at the end, and the Didache concludes with the instruction, but concerning food, bear what you are able, but particularly abstain from that which is offered to idols, for that is service to dead gods. And you might detect a slight Pauline bent in that statement. What follows is less clear, but there is still a similarity between the two documents. Where, following the discussion of food, the Serach proceeds to discuss communal rules, the Didache proceeds to discuss immersion, which is a communal affair. When someone is immersed, at least the person who is immersing that person, the immersee, is to fast, but preferably the whole community, everyone who knows them. Prayer is continued, and blessing, and here we have a rendition of the Lord's Prayer. And then there are blessings before and after communal meals, a form of Birkat Hamazon. And while the word Eucharist is used, thanksgiving is used of this section, and therefore many commentators take it to be a reference to the Eucharist. That does not come later until chapter 14. This is actually the Birkat Hamazon, the Messianic version, you could say. The Didache then proceeds to more rules by which the community might be managed in terms of leadership and the reception of traveling teachers and prophets. It then proceeds, finally, as I mentioned in Didache 14, to discuss the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the election of community leaders, and then its final chapter, its eschatological chapter, is very much after the pattern of Matthew 24. The similarity is that although the order is somewhat different between the Didache and the Sirach, nevertheless they cover the same types of materials in the general order, that in the same general order. So we have to ask, as many have before, was there any relationship, and if so, what was it, between the early church and the Essenes? Did the Sirach have an influence on the formation of the Didache? The Didache is obviously a patchwork of various documents. Anyone reading it can see that quickly, and certainly it's been the subject of much study and dissection. But we consider it to have been redacted by a person that we might call the Didachist. He is the final editor, the final person who put the final touches on what was obviously a developing theme of instruction. He is in the early church. He is the one who assembled these documents. So then we can ask, did this Sirach play a role in how he selected and organized his material? So now that we've talked a little bit about the Sirach, I would like to go on a little bit more and talk about the Didache and the Gentiles. Its short title, which is, the people call it the inscriptio, it's the title that would have been written on the outside of a scroll, so that in an ancient library where you would have scrolls that were without spindles, rolled up, tied with a string and stuck in cubicles that or in the wall like pigeonholes, you would be able to tell what was in the scroll by this writing, the inscriptio, on the outside. That's what forms the title for the book today, The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. This Didache is our best and nearly only source on the relationship between the Jewish people and the church in the very early years of the church outside the New Testament. Increasingly, scholars are dating it to sometime, some have said as early as the 40s, but that's highly unlikely, but sometime between 60 and 100 CE. Previously, years ago, people used to date it as being in the 3rd century, but the Dead Sea Scrolls have changed all of that. At this point, I hope I haven't lost it again. Okay. At this point, we're going to see that the writer is clearly writing from within the Jewish literary world. And the first issue between the Didachists and the Gentiles was the issue of their relationship to God should they become part of the ecclesia. What are we going to do with these Gentile converts in communities that are springing up around the region of Syria and elsewhere? Interestingly, we can see right away in the very title that we've mentioned, in the title that is in the text, we can see that there is an understanding of a Jewish-Gentile distinction, because this is a teaching that is to the Gentiles. This is the teaching for the nations. This distinction carries through into the very first verse following, where we read that first, the first command is to love the God who made you, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. We might ask, where does this interesting phrase, love the God who made you, come from? And it is simply because the author understands that this is not the God who delivered Israel from Egypt, as is the original context of the saying, but for all humanity, he is the God who made us all. So while the language seems to echo the Hebrew Bible, it also makes a distinction. For the Israelite, the Shema is preceded by reference to the Lord, the God of your fathers, and followed by reference to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And it goes without saying that for Gentile recipients of the Didache, the gods of their fathers were the gods of the heathen, and their fathers were not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they have been specifically addressed in terms that apply to them and apply to all of us as human beings. And so the Didache takes everything that is here and applies it to human life and applies it to the life of the believer. He unites us and says, this is the teaching that relates to these matters. Bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. He tells the Didache Christians, as we might call them, do the Gentiles not do this as well? And again, now this is curious language, because he's just said he's writing to the Gentiles, and then he tells the Gentiles, this is the way that you ought to live. You ought to love those who love you. And he said, but why is it so great to love those who love you? Do the Gentiles not do this as well? But you should love those who hate you. In other words, he is now uniting them under the instruction of Yeshua the Messiah. And so there is a sense in which the Gentiles are Gentiles, but already we're beginning to see a little bit of a blurring of the boundaries, because the Gentiles who have come to faith are also in some ways different from other Gentiles. In the original context of the Master's saying, this is Toby Janicki, a friend of ours. In the original context of the Master's saying, he comments, Yeshua used the term Gentiles in antithesis to his Jewish disciples. In the same way, when the word appears in the context of Didache 1 and 3, it must be understood to refer to idolaters who have not yet accepted the God of Israel. The in and the out are different. There are people who are in the community, and there are those who are without. This is, of course, in line with the way the word is used in the New Testament. And that in itself is a bigger discussion. But it does alert us to the fact that even in the earliest days, there was some differentiation going on between Gentiles who were pagans and Gentiles who had come to God, without applying the term proselyte to them. Following these initial commands, the Didache proceeds to lay out the obligations of the Gentile disciple. These obligations are laid out in a strikingly Torah-like fashion. I write in my dissertation, which has been published by Wipf and Stock, that the Didachist gives the Didache, or his teaching here, all the authority of the Torah. He exalts the teacher in the same way as was done in Second Temple Judaism. It was not only the Essenes who demanded that people obey their instructor and look forward to the day of the teacher of righteousness. These were the days following the Zugot, or pair of teachers, the last of whom were Hillel and Shammai, whom we mentioned. And it was the day dawning the era of the Tanaim, whose teachings, based on those of the Zugot, would in turn become the basis for the Mishnah. While rabbinic authority had not yet developed as it would to those who followed the teachings of Second Temple Judaism and their teachers were indeed authoritative, and the Didache took that authority to itself. And we see this level of authority very much in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where so often the authority of the teacher is absolute and not to be questioned. In addition to this, the Didache asserts that the authority of the Lord himself, because it says this is the teaching of the Lord through the 12 apostles. It uses what we call the Sectio Evangelica or Evangelica. This is a section where verses are used that reflect very closely, in some ways, the Sermon of the Mount, particularly in verses 3 to 5. And the Didache again reflects the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 16. Again, in that text, asserting the authority of the Lord. But perhaps that is all just a preface to the authority that the Didache is exerting upon or taking upon itself for its readers, as in Didache chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5, we have 3 lists of commands for the Gentile. Each list is slightly different, but covers the same ground. And each of these 3 lists argues on the basis of the commands of the second table of the law. This is something that was initially noted by a scholar in South Africa, Jonathan Draper, and helped me to form my own arguments concerning the Didache. In each list, all 5 of these commands are mentioned. In each list, the commands concerning murder, adultery, and theft are reproduced also in the very same order as they occur in the Hebrew text, but with other commands in between them. And this varies depending on the list, but what you get is the sense that what is being developed is a halacha for the Gentile, basically taking the second table of the Torah and applying it to them in their context. And so, to me, there is no doubt that the Didache intended to apply the Torah to its Gentile recipients. You might be asking yourself, what about the first table of the Torah then? What was the Didache doing with that? Certainly, we've been told, love the God who made you, and we're reminded of the beginning of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, where Israel is told, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. We have it behind us, Ani Adonai, Anochi Adonai. And we are told that he only should be worshipped. But from then on, the commands that are given in that first table are basically given short shrift. It's interesting because this omission seems to be quite intentional. While it's clear that all of us, all of humanity, should worship the Lord our God, it seems that the Didache was referring specifically to what was applicable to the Gentile convert and leaving the rest. God was the one, for example, who said to the children of Israel, you shall not take the Lord your God in vain. There is some allusion to this command in the Didache, but specifically, the fourth and fifth commands are not introduced to the Didachean believer. For example, the command to keep the Sabbath day is commanded in Exodus 20 on the basis of God's creation on the seventh day. So one might think that it is a command for all people. However, Deuteronomy chapter 5 clarifies and gives an entirely different or additional rationale, that of the Exodus from Egypt. This serves to clarify that the reason for the day of rest is based in Israel's redemption, and the reason for it being on the seventh day of the week is because that was God's day of rest. Despite Philo's general advocacy of the Sabbath to all humanity, for many Jews of the first century, the Sabbath was something specific to Israel. Jubilees chapter 2 is representative of this in regard to the Sabbath, reading, the Creator of all blessed it, but he did not sanctify any people or nations to keep the Sabbath thereon, with the sole exception of Israel. He granted to them alone that they might eat and drink and keep the Sabbath thereon upon the earth. And this interpretation is corroborated, or probably originates from Exodus chapter 31, where we read, and the Lord said to Moses, you are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. And those who are familiar with the Sabbath liturgy know that this is reproduced. Ot hi le'olam. This is a sign forever between God and Israel. This commandment, therefore, is specifically associated with Israel, and therefore is not reproduced in the Didache for the Gentile believer. Then, relevantly, the fifth command to honor one's father and mother is particularly striking. Connected with a promise, Exodus 20 reads, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Here, whether long life is for the individual or nation, the point is that it is connected to life in the land given by God. And so the Didache, while it nowhere gives a hint of disrespect for parents, nevertheless omits this command. So it does seem, although it is not conclusive, it seems that the Didache is specifically applying the second table of the Decalogue to all humanity, but understands the first table as largely, specifically connected to the people of Israel. This is Important now when we return to the prohibition of idolatry. The Didache does include this command. This command has universal applicability. It is specific, it is clear. It is comparable to the description of the path of the Black One and the path of eternal death in a related text, the book of Barnabas 20, verse 1, which begins with idolatry at the head of its list of those things that destroy people's souls. As in the Didache, Barnabas omits the other commands of the first table of the Torah, but unlike the Didache, there is no tripartite repetition of the second table. It is possible that Barnabas is reflecting the division between the universal and particular commands of the tables, but without the evidence of this stress on the Decalogue and the second table, there's little material present on which to draw a conclusion. So coming to the end of this first discussion on the Didache, it's evident that in the first century, at least in terms of the Didache, which was written sometime shortly after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, there are some clear observations which we can make about the early church and the Jewish people. We began by noting that in this time period, it is not so easy to distinguish between the two. Certainly, any attempt to distinguish between Judaism and Christianity is an anachronism for that day, as it neither truly existed at this time, and not only did the distinction not truly exist, but neither did Judaism or Christianity in many ways, except perhaps in nascent form. We further noted that one can't properly speak of the church and Jewish people because as a whole, the Jewish people, in terms of a relationship, because as a whole, the Jewish people were the church at that time, struggling, as the Didache shows, and doing quite well, in incorporating Gentile members into their community. These Gentiles, however, are not considered Jews. They were not expected to keep the Torah in terms of those precepts connected to the Jewish people, the ones in the first table of the two tablets of the law. Nevertheless, in our discussion, we've seen some glimmers of what you might call identity formation, as in the New Testament, in that the Gentiles of the church are sometimes referred to as other than just pagan Gentiles from which they have come, but are distinct in some ways from them. So that brings us to the end of our first talk.
Ask for questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
I never studied Didache in depth, but I recently read it, and it's an interesting piece of literature. Something which I also remember from studying church history. Like I remember, like my church history teacher said back then, it's like that. And I wonder what you would say about that. Like he said, it's basically also an instruction that would be given to people who would be baptized, because it seems to say it also somewhere there, like after you have said these words, then baptize them. So it's like when I was reading it, made me think of which is quoted also in it, like Matthew 28, like teach them all that I have commanded you. So that this is simply an attempt to kind of do what Jesus said, like teach them all that I commanded you, and baptize them. So it's like a first century discipleship document. Is that a good characterization?
Yeah,
what you say about that?
It absolutely is. It isn't primarily directed at the leaders of the community, although they are mentioned at that point, but to the community as a whole, including the leaders. But very much that conclusion at the end of the three repetitions of the second table of the Torah, along with all of the halachot, you could call them, the interpretations that go along with it, that statement at the end that the inductee has to accept all that has been just taught to them before they can be immersed, that's very critical, and it's an important turning point in the text. And you know, there's been a fair bit of study done on the couple verses where that occurs. Thank you.
Is there any other question that you'd like to raise? All right.
Maybe another one. Like just
Another one? Okay.
question of clarification.
Let me get the mic back to you, but as you're thinking about formulating that question, let me ask Daniel how you see the influence of the Mishnah on the writing of the New Testament, recognizing that the codification was much later than the New Testament. But go ahead.
I think that's one I think that's more a question as to what was the influence of the rabbis of the day and their teaching on the writing of the New Testament, because their teaching is what becomes the Mishnah later on and ends up being written down. And you can see that there's some respect for the religious leaders of the day in the New Testament, exhibited both by Yeshua and by Paul. It isn't, they aren't, you know, uncompromisingly critical of them. And Yeshua sits in their midst. But you don't see much. I've never studied this in depth, and so I can't really say. It's an interesting thing I might like to follow someday, but I don't see much direct influence. You certainly see issues regarding halacha that they raise and that become part of the discussions in the Gospels. You certainly see halachic issues that were issues of the day in the Pauline literature. And certainly you see in what I was taught was called the Hebrew Christian epistles, but people like to call them the Catholic epistles. Certainly you see in those very Jewish epistles at the end of the New Testament, you see a number of Jewish concerns that were concerns of the days and concerns of the rabbis reflected in them. So, yeah.
This is more a question of clarification, like as the theme is the early church and the Jewish people, like kind of what's your main point you want to make with the Didache, like that you start the seeing of a separate Gentile Christian identity?
Yes. Yeah, that is the main point that I want to make, is that even very early on, sometime around the destruction of the temple, even at that early period as churches were being developed, the authors of the Didache intended to maintain that distinction between Israel and the Gentile church. And they saw Israel as being beholden to the entire Torah, both tablets, but the Gentiles as only being obligated to keep the second tablet of the law. Gentiles here are not specifically told to keep the Sabbath. In fact, I didn't mention it, but the opposite, there is mention of the Lord's Day, and it's kind of assumed that they might be worshiping on the Lord's Day on Sunday, the first day of the week. And that is no problem at all in the Didache. So he sees there's a divergence. There's one community, the Didache says, all that will be gathered from the four corners of the earth, which might be almost supersessionist in the way it phrases that, but at the same time there's a distinction between Israel and the nations.
As we're talking about distinctions, I wonder also who are the hypocrites in the Didache?
Okay.
Is that like kind of a distancing itself from the Pharisees, of early like predecessors of rabbinic Judaism?
Yeah, the hypocrites are mentioned a number of times in the Didache. I was going to mention them a little bit later on as well. But they are not necessarily the Pharisees, so to speak, but the language is very similar to that of Matthew. Matthew and the Didache are considered two closely related documents, with James also thrown in there as closely related as well. Matthew talks a lot about the Pharisees as hypocrites, uses those words. So does the Didache, but I don't think the Didache is speaking specifically of Pharisees, but he's speaking of those who follow in their footsteps and are the ones that the Christians that the Didache is addressed to are interacting with, probably in Antioch, most likely in towns and the region of Syria in general. Jews who think differently, possibly Jews who are traditional and disagree with their faith in Yeshua. Yes, yeah. But that said, it could also be law-abiding Jews who do believe in Yeshua that are being called hypocrites. We really don't know the answer to that question completely.
Are there any other questions that you would like to raise? Anyone? All right, let me just step up here beside you. Thank you, Dr. Nessim. Appreciate it very much. You've stimulated our thinking about literature of the New Testament period, especially the Didache. And we're going to take a break and reconvene at 11 o'clock. So you can be thinking about questions that you want to raise yourself. The next session is Christian and Messianic Jewish writings before Nicaea. So I'm sure we'll refer again to the Didache, but other writings as well. So we'll adjourn for this moment and come back at 11 o'clock for the next lecture. think we're ready to begin. Good morning again. For those of you who are joining us online, we're very happy to have you with us. And we're about to start the second lecture from Dr. Daniel Nessim on the Christian literature that existed between the Messianic Jewish believers and the Council of Nicaea. I wanted to just say a word or two about the Feinberg Center. I'm Greg Haig. I'm the program director of the center, and we began this program in conjunction with Talbot School of Theology of Biola University back in 2007, and we exist for the purpose of providing academic training that leads to a Master of Divinity in Messianic Jewish Studies. It's a unique program around the country, and so we're happy to host these lectures about once a year. And this year we're having one professor who's teaching for us, and that is Daniel Nessim. He was introduced earlier in the first hour, and now I'm going to ask Daniel to come up and take it away for this next hour, and then we'll break for lunch at 12 o'clock, 12:30. We'll break for lunch, and then we'll come back again at 1:30 for the last lecture. Okay, Daniel?
Thank you, Dr. Hegg. Okay, well, now we have spent the first hour, we talked about primarily the distinction between, or the very muddy, that word just came up, distinction between Jew and Gentile Christian, or the Jewish people and the church in the first century. We talked about how really it's hard to differentiate between the two. The church was in many ways part of the Jewish people, even though it was increasingly Gentile. But now what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is look at some of the authors of this 3-century-long period before Nicaea, or what we would call actually the Constantinian era. So we've seen these distinctions occurring. We talked a little bit about the word Christian. The word Christian only occurs 3 times in the New Testament. It's a word that, however, is quickly taken up and turns up in other literature. And in the New Testament, it's not necessarily a term that has great merit to itself. In the third time the term Christian is used, it is actually used in such a way that we can tell that it probably had some shameful connotations, some pejorative, like insult-related connotations, and had to be reclaimed by the early believers. So far from just taking the insult and cowering, they took it and owned it and accepted it. That it was in Antioch where the New Testament tells us the word Christian or Christianus was first used is quite significant, especially as there are a number of key early Christian documents that come from Antioch, and also a number of key Christian leaders that come from Antioch in the first centuries. We've already touched upon the Didache, and there's a lot of discussion as to was the Didache composed in Egypt or was it composed somewhere else? But most people have come to the conclusion that Antioch is the most likely place. Now, Antioch is buried under a sea of mud today, and what was standing in Antioch just a few weeks ago is largely damaged because of the terrible earthquake that's occurred there. But Antioch was a regional power at the time. It was a significant city in the Roman Empire, and it was also a significant city in terms of the history of the Jewish people, as governor of Syria was at one point stationed there, as well as his army. The Didache, as I date it, was written sometime around the year 70 or shortly after. I'm pretty sure it would have been complete by the year 80, and not edited significantly, at least, any time after that. But shortly after the Didache, we have some letters written by a bishop of Antioch. And that bishop is Ignatius, or if you want to be picky, Ignatius. And these letters were written, however, not in Antioch, but while he was on his way to Rome to be, as he puts it, torn apart by wild beasts. Something that he was really looking forward to, so that he might participate in the suffering of his Savior. He seems to have been on a roll during his trip to Rome, quite excited about the prospect. There is no negativity in his letters. He seems excited about what's going to happen. This is kind of going to be the climax as well as the end of his life. But in his writing, as he gives his final instructions to churches that he has a relationship with or knows about, he gives them instructions that he hopes will guide them into the future. The year is probably around 110, and in his writings, we can already see a growing distinction between the early church and the Jewish people. In his mind, there is now more of a division than there was before. So he is not ashamed to use the word Christian. Discrimination or singling out of the church as Christians is just one angle by which the church and the Jewish people were being separated as at this time. The church obviously was becoming increasingly populated by Gentiles, and in Ignatius's day and before his day, in the time between the Didache and his letters to the various churches, the Gentiles were beginning to find themselves in a rather precarious position. And this wasn't just because there were viewpoints floating around, such as that of the Didache, which put them under the Torah in a sense, but under different limited obligations than the Jewish people. It wasn't just because there was some form of class distinction going on in the early church, but even more so, there was a growing sense of anti-Semitism, if you want to take a more modern term and apply it to that day, growing in the Roman Empire, and certainly within Antioch itself. That was a really hospitable city for the Jewish people. It was a city where they had a very long history, established in 300 BCE, and yet one that was now beginning to experience periodic pogroms against the Jewish people. The Jewish people in Antioch and elsewhere were an established ethnic group with special civil rights and special privileges in the Roman Empire in that day. In a sense, they were a nation within a nation. The Roman Empire was not quite a nation or an empire in the way that we think of nations and empires today, as the idea of a nation state being a multi-ethnic nation in which all people are equal, something that has arisen in the last couple hundred years, was not really the conception of people in the Greco-Roman day. And so the Jews were a nation within a nation. Christianity, by contrast, was a newcomer on the scene and had no obvious claims to being a legitimate religion. It was, by all appearances, to outsiders, what would appear to the Romans, what we would call today, a cult. It was a marginal group. The situation of Gentile Christians was further difficult because while the Jewish believers, they could go as Jews and their category was clear, their situation became more difficult also because of the fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish tax. Now, this was a tax on all Jewish people, which until the temple was destroyed was applied to them so that they might fund the operation of the temple in Jerusalem. After the destruction of the temple, that fiscus Judaicus began to be used for other things objectionable to the Jewish people, pagan worship in the city of Jerusalem. As a tax on the Jews, it was applicable to all Jews. No doubt Messianic Jews, if we want to, again, use a modern term, apply it to an ancient situation. After the First Jewish War, Vespasian, who had begun the siege on Jerusalem, was now emperor. And he was enforcing this tax upon the Jewish people so that they might take this money, and as an insult of sorts, this money would be diverted to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. The tax was for 2 drachmas, which was more or less 2 days' wages. So for most people, it was neither a huge amount nor an insignificant amount of money. It was something, though, that was a slap in the face for the Jewish people, many of whom had opposed the war against Rome in the first place. Not all Jews were for that war. What made it worse was Vespasian's son Domitian. Domitian reigned from 81 to 96 CE when he became emperor. Domitian was an authoritarian. He administered the tax harshly. Courts would publicly inspect men's genitals to see if they were circumcised and if they were or were not Jews who were avoiding paying the tax. If they were trying to avoid the tax, they could lose all of their property. I'm tempted to make a joke there, but I'll avoid it. In terms of the relationship between the church and the Jewish people, it was ruled that if someone who was not Jewish was living a Jewish lifestyle, they not only had to pay the tax, but were also forced to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods and to the Roman emperor. This was going to be a double whammy for the Jewish believer, for the Gentile believer. They were being classed as Jews in terms of the tax, but they were being forced to worship the emperor as Romans and Greeks and pagans. Obviously, this put certain members of the church in not just a financial, but also a theological bind. Worship of the emperor was completely forbidden, not only to Jews, but also to Gentile Christians. And so, since not only Christian Jews, but any Christian Gentiles who were in close contact with them were subject to these laws, there was a motive for the Gentile to distance himself or herself from both Jewish believers and Jewish practices. The Emperor Nerva, he was from 96 to 98, who would succeed Domitian after he was assassinated, rolled back Domitian's harsh rules, even coining some coins that indicated that, saying that the offense was being rolled back. But the damage in terms of the social division in the church was already done. This would be another factor in the division of the church between the church and the Jewish people. Because as we discussed last hour, generally the church was considered part of, at least in some way, part of the Jewish people. By the time of the Second Jewish War, or we could say the third in some respects because there was an intervening one as well, in 132 to 135 CE, it was the Fiscus Judaicus, this tax, was an institution that still had a long life ahead of it. And so naturally this had a significant contributing effect. It provided impetus to the church's trajectory away from its Jewish origins and the Jewish people. Christians had ample motivation to set aside any Jewish practices and association with the Jews to avoid Domitian's persecution and any social discrimination as well that might involve. In fact, various scholars argue that they would take steps to show the Romans that they were indeed distinct from the Jewish people. A Christian identity was being formed in which Jews could have no part, because a Jewish Christian could not claim to be a Gentile Christian and get away with it. If they took part in this new Christian identity that was in a sense a legal cover for the Gentile Christian, they would endanger it. Also, Messianic Jews could also lose their status in the eyes of the Roman Empire, no longer being classified as Jews, but in some cases as unlicensed atheists. So this is the context that Ignatius comes into. On the Jewish side, there was a divergence between the church and the Jewish people that was developing, although along different lines. And I think we're all familiar with the issue of the minim, the Birkat HaMinim. Here, the Jewish believer, according to some, was estranged from the world of the Tanaim and their society. The traditional view, and I'm going to argue a little bit about this, Travers Herford quotes the Tosefta on Shabbat 13. The margins and books of the Minim they do not save, but these are burnt in their place, they and their memorials, that is the sacred name that would be in the texts of the Jewish believers, are to be burned. Rabbi Yosei the Galilean says, on a weekday, one cuts out the memorials and hides them and burns the rest. Rabbi Tarfon said, may I lose my son. Can't think of a more horrific statement than that. If they come into my hand, I would burn them and their memorials too. If the pursuer were pursuing after me, I would enter into a house of idolatry, and I enter not into their houses. For the idolaters do not acknowledge God and speak falsely concerning him. But these, the Messianic Jews, do acknowledge him and speak falsely concerning him. Rabbi Ishmael said, whereas God says, let my name which is written in holiness be blotted out in water, how much more the books of the Minim, which put enmity and jealousy and strife between Israel and their Father who is in heaven, should be blotted out, and their memorials, the name of God, as they wrote it, too. So in this passage, we have a rather sad record of the Tanaim. The most prominent in the text being Rabbi Tarfon. Tarfon, who survived the destruction of the temple, continued after it to be a distinct follower of its practices, continuing to eat the tithe. But he was also a noted opponent elsewhere as well of the Jewish believers. And so the context is a discussion what to do with the texts of these early believers. We can presume these might have been the Gospels, possibly Hebrew fragments from the Gospels. There are remnants that are spoken about in the Church Fathers in Hebrew, and possibly Aramaic, because people didn't distinguish in that day so much between Hebrew and Aramaic. The rather shocking position of Rabbi Yosei and ultimately Rabbi Ishmael is that these texts, complete with the divine name within them, should be destroyed one way or another, even burned. And it should be noted this is completely opposite from Jewish custom, where we never burn the name of the Lord. You don't throw sacred texts in the fire, you bury them, and bury them in a way that gives them the greatest of respect, as if they were human themselves. In the midst of that harsh discussion, now remember, this is written after the time period we are talking about, but is supposedly recording rabbis of this early day, the days of the Didache leading up to the days of Ignatius. In the midst of this already harsh discussion, Rabbi Tarfon states that he would not only burn them, but would not enter the house of a Jewish believer even if his life depended on it, using that horrific curse, even if my son's life depended on it. He views the Jewish believer as worse than a pagan or idolater, especially because as Jews, they should know better. And I think we can see that attitude continuing even today to some degree, as Jews who are believers in Yeshua are considered in some ways worse than Christians. This estrangement between Jew and Jew may not have been one-sided either, for the Didache, as we saw before, shows a marked desire to separate its Gentile recipients from Jews who might have an influence on them. Thus, Didache 8 instructs, "Your fasts shall not be kept with the hypocrites, for they fast on the second day," that's Monday, Yom Sheni, "and the fifth, Thursday. You must fast on the fourth, Wednesday, and preparation, Friday. Neither shall you pray like the hypocrites, but as the Lord called you to in his gospel." The Didache is clearly trying to make sure that the believers they are writing to will not end up praying with Jewish traditionalists on their days of fasting, but that they will fast on a separate day. They are attempting to force a social division. And so it seems to be a significant concern to the Didache, and we had a question regarding this in the first hour, which warns its disciples against being hypocrites, telling them to hate all hypocrisy in Didache 4, and reminding them that hypocrisy is one of the things that characterizes the way of death in Didache 5. And so the Jewish rejection of Jewish believers has already been met by reciprocal rejection of religious Jews by the Jewish believers, also involving those who are not Jewish, trying to keep the Gentiles away from the influence of the religious. This, the social effect of the Fiscus Judaicus and more, these difficulties had a roll-on effect in part because of the concurrent development in the church of supersessionism. This supersessionism, as we will see, may in part have been in reaction to the diminished Jerusalem and Jewish Jesus movement, but also from other factors, an appropriation of Israel's eschatological prospects and the conviction that God was now judging the Jewish people for rejecting their Messiah. Back to Ignatius. He is one of the earliest church writers to demonstrate these trends in church thinking. His writings, perhaps also in light of the Didache's somewhat Torah affirmative stance, show the dual Christian redefinition of what Torah is, what it means for the believer, and its redefinition of what the hope of Israel is, appropriating it in some ways. He frequently, as we suggested, uses the word Christian, attesting to its now honorable connotations, at least in his circle. In his letter to the Ephesians, he attests to Jesus being of the race, and he uses the Greek word genos, of the people of David, qualified, of course, by saying, according to the flesh. To the Magnesians, he seeks to distance them from Judaism, saying, for if we have lived according to Judaism until now, we admit that we have not received God's gracious gift. Already at this early date, then, there is a rejection of Judaism. There's a rejection also of the Sabbath in favor of the Lord's Day. And then, categorically, Ignatius proceeds to assert that it is outlandish to proclaim Jesus Christ and practice Judaism, for Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. And we'll clarify that rather strange phrase in a few minutes. Christianity in which every tongue that believes in God has been gathered together. In somewhat the same vein, using a similar form of expression, Ignatius tells the Philadelphians, if anyone should interpret Judaism to you, do not hear him. For it is better to hear Christianity from a man who is circumcised than Judaism from one who is uncircumcised. Whatever Ignatius means to say by these statements while on his way to martyrdom, it's clear that he is seeking to distance the churches of the Magnesians and Philadelphians from Judaism. The question we may want to ask is, what Judaism is he talking about? Is he talking about Gentiles who are attending synagogues? Or is he talking about Gentiles who are associating with Jewish believers in Yeshua, or with other Gentiles who have accepted a more Jewish form of Christianity? Matt Johnson McCabe highlights this development in his new significant work, Jewish Christianity, the Making of the Christianity-Judaism Divide. Then as now, it's anachronistic, he says, to speak of any such thing as Judaism, as its definition depended on whom you were talking about. Further, one may want to think about the obvious implication of Ignatius' letter. There were those in the Magnesian church who did practice Judaism, or else this wouldn't have been written. Ignatius is part of the process of the church working to create a divide. This is a process that would continue, identity formation, beyond the 3 centuries we are looking at today, for even Chrysostom. And Chrysostom lived in the latter part of the 4th century, died in the early 5th. Chrysostom, and from Antioch himself, struggled to enforce this divide while Archbishop of Constantinople. Remember, he was in the middle of a series of sermons against the Arians, and he had to interrupt himself because the Jewish holidays were coming along, and he wrote a number of harsh sermons against Judaism and Jewish practices. But what kind of Judaism was Ignatius writing about? Something recognizably Jewish, something he viewed as destructive to the gospel, and possibly for good reason, and something that members of his recipient churches had no apparent problem with. Again, he wouldn't have been writing about this, it wouldn't have been on his mind if there was not an issue. Gentiles were hanging out with Jews one way or another, or at least adopting Jewish practices. We can go beyond Ignatius, and chronologically we could get from him shortly after to Clement. And it's important to remember that while various writings have been attributed to Clement, most famously the Clementine homilies and the related Clementine recognition, these works are actually pseudonymous. They were not written by him. While they themselves are quite late, perhaps around 400 CE, these recognitions and homilies do contain information that is of interest to those who want to find out about Christian Judaism. They record an ancient strata of information, ancient literature. This is primarily contained in some fascinating sermons by Peter, the Kerygmata Petru, as they are generally termed, and they seem to contain material from the late 2nd century. At this point, I'd like to look at 2nd Clement, though, just for a moment, and that is dated in 140 CE. In it, we find some similarities to the Didache. Here, Clement, or someone using his name, speaks of the God who created you. That's the wording of the Didache. It's quite different in the Greek from the Didache's God who made you, but nevertheless, there is a similarity. Further, it is worth noting that actually I misspoke. He did not say God who created you, he said God who created us. The Didache says the God who made you. That's because it's a Jew writing to Gentiles. This is Clement, who presumably is at this point a writer after Clement, who is saying God who created us. He has absorbed what the Didache has taught. He identifies himself with the Gentiles. As does the Didache, he cites the Sermon on the Mount, enjoining his readers to love their enemies and those who hate you, following Luke chapter 6, verse 27, over that's the way that statement is written in Matthew 5 and verse 44. 2nd Clement speaks much about the need for repentance from the whole heart, something we would agree with. From a sincere heart, he says, somewhere else. And then elsewhere later on, with a pure heart. And later on, from deep within. This lays the groundwork for Clement to speak on the relationship between Christ and the church. And this is where he makes a seminal statement that the church has not come into being just now, but has existed from the beginning. For it existed spiritually, as did our Jesus. And even though the church was spiritual, it became manifest in Christ's flesh. We'd be wise not to pass this statement by, because it represents a shift in Christian attitudes towards their own identity during this period, however aware or not they might have been to the Jewish roots of their faith. Here is a conception of the church as having always been, and having always been something that transcended and was detached from the Jewish people. In other words, they're viewing Christianity as something that began long before the church began on the day of Pentecost. That is not their view. And of course, it's the view of many today who might ask questions like, was Abraham a Christian? That same kind of mentality, that there is something that goes over and above both, that overarches. But Clement identifies that with the church, that is now the Gentile people, and is, while somewhat inclusive of the Jewish people, also something distinct. So this is probably what is behind Ignatius's statement to the Magnesians a minute ago that we mentioned, that Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. In other words, Ignatius is saying Judaism had some of the truth of Christianity, but not all of it. To press the point further, this is a distancing of the teaching of the church from the teaching of the synagogue. Even in a book that seems somewhat similar in some respects, as I showed, to a book like the Didache, there is the beginning of a supersessionist conception that says, actually, our roots are not in the works of God with the nation of Israel, but in a reality that overarches the nation of Israel. It's problematic. There's some partial truth in there, but it's also a distortion. So now we can return to these kerygmata Petru. These are the preachings of Peter in the homilies and the recognitions of Clement. They are part of what is presumed to be a Grundschrift, a basic foundational document underlying much of the homilies and recognitions. And there's strong evidence that this kerygmata Petru actually is material rooted in the late 2nd century. It shows that there was there, and in the day when this was written into the recognitions and homilies, a form of Christianity that we see elsewhere, one strong enough to have survived and perhaps later be the whipping boy of John Chrysostom in the late 4th century, a form of Christianity that was Jewish in many ways, whether or not all of its members were Jewish. People who studied the recognitions of these pseudo-Clementines are more and more aware that and agreed that the audience is predominantly Gentile, and that this document is casting Peter as the opponent to Pauline Christianity. We might wonder why such a document could be written around the year 400. Clearly, Jewish Christianity, whatever it was continuing in that day, continuing to be a thing. Recently, there's actually been a lot of shade cast on the Clementines by significant scholars like Graham Stanton and James Carlton Paget, both from Cambridge. And they're probably right. It is difficult to have any meaningful form of textual criticism, to know what is what when you're dealing with a text where you're not sure what the Grundschrift is, this hypothetical document that underlies part of these recognitions is, and you're not sure whether or not and how much of that is the preaching of Peter. It's difficult to know what is going on. Still, what the Clementines demonstrate is undoubtedly a strand of Christianity. Sorry, my computer's playing tricks on me again, going to sleep. We'll get there. Yeah. Still, demonstrate a strand of Christianity persisting well after our period of 3 centuries that has a strong relationship to a Jewish form of Christianity. The Clementines hold to the ongoing validity of the law. They speak about the ongoing value of Jewish customs. They're generally silent in terms of any form of supersessionism or triumphalism. At the same time, they are clear in their exaltation of Yeshua, but as we've seen, they have grave problems with Paul, and in addition, they have grave problems with his authenticity as a person and his vision on the road to Damascus, as after all, anyone can have a vision. And so they contest the form of gospel that he preached to the Gentiles. Perhaps their very existence betrays an underlying tension that's evident in evangelicalism and in the Messianic movement as well today, where there are those who struggle to reconcile the identity of the Jewish people with their own identity as Gentile believers and struggle to figure out what their obligations are and what their relationship to Israel is. That aside, we can go on from Clement now to Barnabas. Barnabas was probably written in Alexandria. Some of the themes of both Ignatius and Clement are reflected more generally by Barnabas, which probably has been written about 10 years after Ignatius's martyrdom. Barnabas reflects Ignatius's negative approach to the Jewish people even further and gives the impression of a rapid hardening of attitudes. Barnabas is interesting in part because he reproduces a good part of the first half of the Didache in its later chapters and basically concludes with that section in Barnabas 18 to 21. Far more than the Didache or even Ignatius, Barnabas references the Hebrew Bible. He speaks not only in general terms of the prophets and Moses, but also of Daniel. He cites Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then he speaks of Abraham at length again by himself, Isaac at length again, Jacob again at length by himself. Joshua he speaks of, Amalek, David, Isaiah, Isaac and Rebekah, Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. He brings up Enoch and even brings up traditions such as are seen in 4Q Ezekiel, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In addition, the book is full of references to places, stories, quotations, allusions, and even some seemingly midrashic Jewish traditions which aren't attested to anywhere else. We could call them a kind of Tosafot, such as Moses stacking shields to stand on in the war against Amalek. One would think that Barnabas, being so in tune, more than Ignatius or the Didache, to the Hebrew Bible origins of faith, would have a greater appreciation of the relationship or even continuity between the church and the Jewish people. But actually, that means nothing. Proves the opposite. Citing Isaiah 1, verses 11 to 13, which is fair enough to quote it, Barnabas nevertheless uses it to strike out with a strident tone, citing also from the prophets and from Psalms. This is what he says. "What is the multitude of your sacrifices to me?" quoting Isaiah, says the Lord. "I am sated with whole burnt offerings and have no desire for the fat of lambs, the blood of bulls and goats. Not even if you should come to appear before me. For who sought these things from your hand? Trample my court no longer. If you bring fine flour, it is futile. Incense is loathsome to me. I cannot stand your new moons and Sabbaths." And so he nullified these things that the new law of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is without the yoke of compulsion, should provide an offering not made by humans. And again he says to them, "Did I command your fathers who came out from the land of Egypt to offer whole burnt offerings and sacrifices to me? No, this is what I commanded them. Let none of you bear a grudge against your neighbor in your heart, and do not love a false oath. So there he's using the Hebrew Bible to testify against itself, to say that the whole system of offerings was false. Barnabas proceeds later in a discussion of Moses to claim Moses understood that the law was broken and cast the 2 tablets from his hands, something the Hebrew Bible never says. And their covenant was smashed, that the covenant of his beloved Jesus might be sealed in our hearts in the hope brought by faith in him. His interpretation of prophetic texts divorces them from Israel. Thus, for some of the things written about him concerning Israel, others concern us. And so it says, he was wounded because of our lawless acts and weakened because of our sins. Further, Barnabas says, therefore the Son of God came in the flesh for this reason, that he might total up all the sins of those who persecuted his prophets to death. Decidedly anti-Jewish stance. Throughout the epistle, Barnabas spiritualizes, and this is one of the notable characteristics of him, he spiritualizes both the Torah and the sacrificial system, reinterpreting everything he addresses to apply to the church. This leads him to write, now let us see whether it is the church or the first one that receives the inheritance, and whether the covenant is for us, the church, or them, the Jews. Barnabas proceeds to reference the events in the founding of Israel where the younger child was preferred over the elder, as was the case with Jacob and Esau, and also with Ephraim and Manasseh. His conclusion? See, Abraham, I have made you a father of the nations who believe in God while uncircumcised. That's Barnabas. I think we have time for one more, and that will be Melito at this point. Melito shows how the boundaries were somewhat blurred. In its relationship to the Jewish people, the letters that we've just read speak of a growing consensus within the church that it's been given the inheritance that Israel has forfeited. The alienation that this implies between church and synagogue becomes yet more painful when one observes that the division was not just between Jewish believers and the Gentile church, but church versus the Jews. The prime example of this is Bishop Melito of Sardis, who lived from 120 to 185 CE. Melito was not only aware of his Jewish heritage, but knew enough of it to draw upon it. He would not have been alone in this, as quite a few of the leaders among the Asian Christians were of Jewish descent. He was a quartodeciman, or a 14er, you could say, celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan along with the Jews, as did other bishops in Asia. Thus, and interestingly, as we're now approaching Passover, he wrote a form of Haggadah, a Eucharistic liturgy called Peri-Pascha. What's striking, especially knowing that he is Jewish, is its anti-Jewish polemic. Perhaps there's a personal element to this. Alistair Stewart writes, we have already seen that Melito's embrace of Christ alienated him from his Jewish family. Melito, as Jew, had cut himself off from his family as a result of his embrace of Christianity, and stands as an exemplar on those whose alienation from his own race is complete. It could be that his reaction, his words against the Jewish people, have a personal motivation. But his anti-Israelism comes to the fore, and it's unfortunate, to say the least. Regarding the sacrifice of Messiah, he says, "What strange injustice have you done, O Israel? You have dishonored the one who honored you. You have disgraced the one who glorified you. You have denied the one who owned you. You have ignored the one who made you known. You have murdered the one who gave you life." And the key word there, that causes problems is the word murdered. O Israel, what have you done? He says. Is it not written for you, you shall not spill innocent blood, so that you might not die the death of the wicked? And then he has Israel say, I, said Israel, I killed the Lord. Why? Because he had to die. And he accuses Israel and says, you have erred, O Israel, to reason so about the slaughter of the Lord. It is not only here, but at numerous points in this Haggadah that the charge of murder is leveled against Israel. All this in a city where Melito's Christian community was probably outnumbered by Jews. There's a very large synagogue that was discovered in Sardis. There's no doubt that Melito intended his words to be convicting and possibly likely motivating to his Christian audience, but their harshness reflected a viewpoint that would resonate throughout history and be used as a rallying cry to this day of those who hate the Jews, that the Jews killed Christ. That said, if one can set it aside, it can hardly be viewed as helpful in the relationship between the Jewish people and the church in his own day. For this, Melito has been called the first poet of deicide, a dubious distinction. And so this brings us to a point, I think, where we should stop for now. We're coming up to our lunchtime, but we've looked at various writers, the last one being a Jewish writer in this period, who are showing an increasingly harsh supersessionist and, you could say, punishing type of supersessionism, punitive supersessionism against the Jewish people, and proclaiming the glories of the Gentile church. We are beginning to see more and more this alienation that is beginning to occur, but in the midst of it, the very strong connections that also still exist, as we saw in Ignatius's and Clement's writings and so forth. So these first 3 centuries are centuries of division, but also centuries that show how hard it was for the leadership of these early churches to separate their flock from the Jewish people. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. I had maybe two questions. Just thinking a little bit about what you just shared about Melito, and of course I see how this has been taken later and been used negatively against the Jewish people, and how it got like a negative continuation in Christian anti-Semitism. But maybe Melito, let me play a little bit the Melito's advocate. I mean, he didn't know yet what was happening, gonna happen with it. But also, what is really, I mean, he was a Jewish believer himself in the first place, but what's really different between what he says and what Peter says on the day of Pentecost? He also says, Jesus whom you crucified, So maybe that's, and then I had a second one, but maybe let's, this one is maybe.
Yeah, that's a good question. My reflexive answer to that right away is that Peter is speaking to people who are in Jerusalem at the time that Yeshua's crucifixion had taken place. And the you is collective to those people there. He's not, he's obviously, and they understand it. He's not saying that each one of them have done it, but everyone is guilty in a sense in that they were there at the time, and they weren't, they're guilty by association. So to speak, and it's meant to convict them and bring them to repentance. When Melito writes, he's writing well over, a good century later. He's writing to Gentiles, and he's leveling that accusation when that generation, of which Yeshua himself said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When that generation is past, and addressing himself to people who would quite likely be hostile to the Jewish people. So the intent is not to bring repentance to those people, but it is to show them that they are better than the Jews, and the Jews have rejected and murdered their Messiah. And I agree with you, he had no intention, of if he had known what his words would do later on, I'm sure he wouldn't have used those words. But also, this is the only surviving document we have just like that. That doesn't mean he's the only person who was saying this at that time. And he's just the one that we have a record of.
So we have a question from online, actually.
Yes.
So it is, here we go. Okay, so what are the implications of the different Jewish Gentile expectations in the Didache for the contemporary Messianic movement?
I think this is where the Didache is a tremendously useful document for us, because I think in the present in the present Messianic movement, there is a confusion among many as to how do Gentiles fit in. And the Didache does portray a community where Jews and Gentiles could mix, but it's not addressed to the Jews, it's addressed to the Gentiles as to how they might participate in that community and be members, and how they might demonstrate their repentance. There's a halacha that is designed for them, but it's based on certain commandments that quite obviously avoid Sabbath, avoid circumcision, which is never mentioned in the Didache, avoid the food laws, except for that one statement, except concerning foods, bear what you can, do what you can, which is very interesting language, because rabbinically, we always say do this or do, you don't say do it if you can. I mean, you either keep kosher or you don't. You don't just try. You're either eating treif or you're not. You're keeping Sabbath or you're not. It is this language, do what you can, which demonstrates that Gentiles are not expected to be Jews, but they are expected to be part of the community and are joined with the community as one when Israel is gathered from the four corners of the earth, when the Lord comes to gather his own. It's an interesting unity but distinction that is shown within the Didache.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Nope, there are. Okay. Running back and forth.
Hi. You said earlier that there was a motive for the Christians to disassociate from Judaism, because they were not a category. They were not categorized as a religion and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, did that continue on into later centuries, that kind of motive to disassociate in that way, or were there other ways, other motives? You talked about that motive. I'm wondering if there were other motives that were. What I'm trying to understand, what was the reasoning for this anti-Jewish sentiment besides the first motive you mentioned?
Yeah, okay, that's really good. First of all, it's worth noting that anti-Jewish sentiment was known within the Roman Empire before, even before Yeshua's time. I mean, people did not like the so-called atheism of the Jews. Some of the same accusations that are falsely leveled against the Jews today were leveled against them today. In that day, you can find a lot of this in a book called Greek and Latin Authors on Jews and Judaism, translating a lot of these texts, their attitudes. So first of all, you have to acknowledge there's a latent sense of, there's a cloud hanging over the Jewish people in this regard. Then you have the wars against Rome, particularly the first one. The second and third, and fourth, which comes far later, they don't really seem to arouse much hostility from the Roman Empire, but the first one sure does. So you have an increasing amount of resentment against the Jewish people, particularly in Antioch, that sent forth an entire force to Jerusalem that were almost completely wiped out by the rebels, an entire Roman division. They would have had resentment against the Jewish people, and it would have made it hard for Gentiles in that situation to easily associate with Jews. Just as today in Israel, it's sometimes dodgy for Jewish and Arab believers to hang out together. I mean, if you do, it can be wonderful, but there are probably some topics you want to avoid, and then, of course, you do have the Fiscus Judaicus. You have the laws that are enacted against the Jewish people. The Fiscus Judaicus is just the one at that point, but in later centuries you have laws that actually, under Theodosius, that actually become prototypical throughout the centuries of how the Jewish people would be treated in Christian Europe, with the prohibition of building synagogues, for example, prohibition of following certain Jewish customs. So there is there's a whole environment that makes it hard. And then, of course, you do have that theological side where, as a Gentile Christian, it would be very tempting to look at the destruction of Jerusalem, which was a horrific war, as Josephus makes very clear, looking at that destruction as a judgment on Israel, particularly as it happened just 40 years after Yeshua's death. So there's a lot of factors that went into that alienation. And of course, that alienation varied tremendously from place to place. And one could assume, even within a given place, some would associate and others wouldn't. Yeah. Thank you.
Just one quick question. I missed the first session, so I apologize if this was covered. But the Didache, what is it? Who were the authors of the document?
I really didn't touch too much on that. I touched on who was the redactor or editor. And we call that person the Didachist, probably finished redacting the document sometime after the year 70, probably near Antioch. The documents come, in part, there's a lot of reliance on the material from the Sirach HaYachad, the Manual of Discipline found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But also there are 3 repetitions of a teaching in very different ways that address obligations to the law, how one ought to behave. There's kind of a halachic discourse, there's kind of a pastoral discourse, and then there's thirdly one that says these are the things that you avoid. All 3 of those include the second tablet of the Torah, of the Decalogue rather, and so they show that the second tablet is clearly being applied to the readers of the Didache. So in terms of authorship, we don't know who the authors of those 3 were, but I do surmise that possibly this is what he is meant in the title by "This is the teaching of the apostles," that this was maybe three different ways in which the apostles, or the ways in which three different apostles possibly had taught this. There's actually some echo of this in the way different apostles are spoken of in later literature as well, where different apostles are given different voices in the Clementines and so forth. But it seems that might preserve a record of their teachings. And the other teachings, the Lord's Prayer, is Matthean. Did Matthew draw from the Didache? Did they draw from a different source? Or is the Didache drawing from Matthew? That's a big discussion that people have. But either way, there's the Lord's Prayer, there's blessings before and after meals, there's all these different components which seem to have been different documents floating around, instructional documents that are cobbled together in the Didache, and we don't know who the documents were. They may or may not have been apostolic in origin. But they're certainly pastoral.
Thank you.
I had a question. Maybe it's too big of a question, but it's something that came up. I've been thinking a bit about recently myself. Like if we, like in our circles, like Jewish mission circles or Messianic circles, kind of we hear the word supersessionism. We say, oh, that's the worst thing, But I was wondering, don't we need, like if we look at like early Christian, what we call supersessionism, do we maybe need like kind of sift it through a little bit more theologically? That like we sift through what's true about it and what's not, what's wrong. Like kind of, I feel a bit dissatisfied by the blanket statement of supersessionism is wrong, because actually there might be things in it which are actually true. So like, I mean, what's in the end like the in the end, if you look at Romans 11, I mean, who are in the olive tree? It's the believers, and unbelieving Jews are not in. So believing, so there is a sense in which Israel is out now. Like from a New Testament perspective, and also like who are really the bearers of how does God's truth continue? Where is it found? Is it found in rabbinic Judaism, or is it found in biblical Christianity? So there might be, I don't know, it's a thing I'm thinking about myself. Shouldn't we sift this through a little bit more? Like what's right and wrong about supersessionism? Obviously, there's a future. I think that my first thing is like that we should not forget we should never think God is done with the Jewish people. But anyway, I don't know, maybe just a thought, like maybe you want to respond.
No, that's a really good comment. I think when you use a label, you're always talking in generalities. So when you talk about Messianic Judaism today, for example, just like Christian Judaism, the equivalent in the early centuries, that's the technical term that many people use that implies it's a form of Judaism that honors Messiah. It's very hard to determine the boundaries. Who can really, I mean, there's a technical, clear definition of who's a Messianic Jew today, one of which means you're Jewish, because the word Jew is in there. But, Messianic Judaism has all kinds of adherents and people at the margins. And the same was the case in the early church. And so with the word supersessionism, you're dealing with a whole range of ideas. The core idea, though, did the church replace Israel, and also in a non-millenarian type of way, permanently displace and replace Israel? That core idea is at the core of what I'm talking about. The idea that the church has replaced Israel, God has rejected Israel. There are certainly, Isaiah says God will do a new thing, and God certainly has done a new thing. He said to his servant, it's too small a thing for you just to be ruler over the tribes of Jacob, but I will give you the nations as your inheritance. There's certainly a developmental thing that goes on throughout Scripture, but without the displacement of Israel. And I'm using supersessionism as kind of a yardstick to differentiate between church and the Jewish people. Because on both sides in the church, you have Jews and Gentiles. And within the Jewish people, you have both Jews who don't believe in Yeshua and you have Jews who do. Because they are clearly, you see in the Talmudic references, within the Jewish world, even if Rabbi Tarfon won't go to their houses if his son's life depends on it. They're still there, you know? So that's how I'm using it, as a label. Certainly, yeah, the point is well taken. We always have to, there's always more definition to be done, more to talk about and investigate.
We have a few minutes more for questions. Any other questions you'd like to raise? Yes, there's another one back there. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess two questions as well, sort of building off what Peter had asked. To what extent were these writers contending against theological error? Not that there wasn't error within their own writings, but were they maybe contending against Judaizing or Judaizers to some degree? And that's what you see reflected there. The second question is, does the is it the Fiscus Judaicus, is that something that keeps, are you saying this is something that keeps Jewish believers within Jewish streams? Yeah. And then also, does the Bar Kokhba revolt, I know you've talked some about this, the Bar Kokhba revolt, do you see this as a parting of the ways? You know, is that totally seal the deal there?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, a few questions there. I hope I remember them all. But I would say, first of all, I like that you said Bar Kokhba. That's his proper name, not Kokhba. He's no star. But I don't think that revolt is nearly as significant as we make it out to be, because Bar Kokhba did bring to an end the dynasty of Jewish bishops that were in Jerusalem. Sure, that came to an end. But on the other hand, I think the power shift was already well in place by 135, the power shift in the church. And it wasn't even completely over at that point. But I wouldn't say that you could say that any date like that marked a definitive division between church and the Jewish people, particularly since the Jewish believers would not have been the only people who were persecuted by Bar Kokhba and his minions. There was a lot of division in Jerusalem. A lot of groups were persecuted. If you want a really hostile view regarding that, Dan Gruber wrote a book called Rabbi Akiva's Messiah, where he really goes after Bar Kokhba and Akiva and some of their actions at that time. And it's very clear, yeah, Jewish believers were attacked, but they were not the only ones by far. There's a process going on in Judaism where a consensus is being built towards a rabbinic norm that takes place over centuries and takes place in parallel with the Christian, also the Christian focusing of power ultimately towards Rome and its own hierarchy. And so but I'm struggling now to remember the first question that you had.
Just about whether they were what extent is there legitimate theological issues that they're speaking into?
Yeah, I think they. I think the whole thing with Judaizing, you mentioned, was definitely an issue. You see it even in Syria in the 4th century, that there is a continued struggle by some to differentiate Christianity from Judaism. There's clearly a strong Judaizing trend, and of course, Judaizing is the practice of applying Jewish tradition and law to those who are not Jewish, and God doesn't require them to keep these traditions. That is still going on for centuries, and you could even argue it goes on until the Muslim conquest, which is in the 7th century. So it's a long enduring stream of Christianity, and to this very day, I think it's well known, Syrian Christianity has many traditions within it that have a strong Jewish flavor. Yeah.
A few more minutes if you
There
would like.
was a question there.
There's another one.
This may be a little off topic, but I wanted to know if any of this would pertain into the making of theological differences that produced the Orthodox branches, not the Jewish Orthodox, but many of the orthodoxies that have gone from Roman Catholic, that would happen centuries later from what we've been talking about.
I find it interesting, that in Eastern Christianity, including Coptic and the Orthodox traditions, you not only see, more Jewish traditions as part of their liturgy and so forth, but also, there's a different date for Easter. It's closer to the Jewish one. And I attribute it to the presence of a lot of Jewish believers in the midst, and them being unable to forget, the fact that their faith came from the Jewish people. I'm sure there's an influence there. Yeah.
Geographical proximity too.
That's it. Yeah.
Last chance. All right. Daniel, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Excellent presentations and responses to the questions. I appreciate it
Thank
very
you.
much. I know all of you do too. Yeah.
Thank you.
And we're going to be taking a break now for lunch, and we'll be back at 1:30 for those of you online. Wish you could join us in our lunch in person here, but all who are here in the assembly will be eating together, and then we'll come back at 1:30 for the next session and talk about the creme de la creme. I think it's going to be a fascinating presentation about supersessionism in particular and the writings that led up to that. So we've got some great questions about it, and I hope that Daniel will be able to address those questions even more thoroughly in the afternoon session. So we'll see you all back here at 1:30. Thank you.